The last 18 months have been fairly tough for China's President Xi Jinping. It all started with the slowdown in the local economy, in the domestic economy, perhaps the slowest growth rate in the last 30 years for China. Then it was the trade war with the United States of America, which resulted in a tech cold war, which involved Huawei, the likes of ZTE, and so on. Then it was the Hong Kong protests, which brought Xi Jinping and his party a lot of diplomatic backlash from the international community, given how China was trying to take over Hong Kong. And lastly, in December last year, it was the coronavirus outbreak. It started in China, it resulted in the lockdown in Wuhan, which lasted for over 2 months. And then it spread to parts of Europe and America, which resulted in further backlash for Jinping and his party. Now, finally, Xi Jinping has attained some success in the form of the political annihilation of Hong Kong. Now, one would say that the fall of Hong Kong was always inevitable given the system it was under. It was always a special administrative region since 1997 when the British handed over Hong Kong back to China. But according to the 1984 declaration that was signed by Britain and China, the liberal principles, the liberal ethos, the democratic principles under which Hong Kong was being governed under the British rule, that was to last for another 50 years. So Hong Kong was to remain a special administrative region for another 50 years, which was from 1997 to 2047. So why has Xi Jinping accelerated this process by at least 27 years? Why has Hong Kong been thrust upon with the new national security law? Let's go it one by one. Now, it all started with an extradition bill which came out last year. It resulted in heavy protests. The bill actually made it possible for suspected criminals in Hong Kong to be tried in mainland China. Now, the problem with this bill was the ambiguity which it came with. Now, criminals could be classified as someone just being critical of the Jinping governance, being critical of China's economy, being critical of anything that was even remotely related to the Chinese Communist Party. They could be taken to mainland China and tried there in the opaque courts where justice is very ambiguous. This was the reason why protesters came out on the streets. And last year, as we saw in plenty of news coverage, they were always in excess of 500,000 people, sometimes even 1 million. And sometimes airports had to be halted. The city's routine functions had to be stopped. These were the kind of protests. Of course, eventually in September, the bill was formally withdrawn by Carrie Lam. However, that wasn't enough. The protests still went on. People wanted investigation into the police brutality that had occurred. Protesters wanted universal voting rights for everyone. The protesters wanted that the protests they had been engaged in not to be classified as rights, even though there was sufficient destruction of public property, because classifying these protests as rights would have led to a prison sentence of 10 years for many people. So, what happened then? Then happened the coronavirus outbreak, and that brought a lull in the protests. It brought a much needed break Jinping was probably looking for. Now, what happened with the protest was two things. One, Hong Kong slipped into a recession. It was already dragging its economy down because of the protests, because of the hindering of the business activity. Coronavirus exasperated it. So there was an imminent recession. The protests died down, and this was the ideal time Xi Jinping took to prepare a national security law. Now, this national security law, ambiguous as it is, it wasn't made public until it was accepted by the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. So, the people of Hong Kong who will be governed under this national security law had no knowledge of the law until it was actually signed by the Hong Kong's Legislative Council. That is how ambiguous and opaque the entire process was. Now, if we go into the details, there are three articles that need specific mention in the new national security law. Of course, it's a 35-page document, so one can go extensively into studying every bit of it. But there are three articles that warrant special attention. One is Article 20. Now, if we take into account the protests last year, there was the threat of secession, subversion, and terrorism. All of them have been criminalized under the new national security law with great ambiguity. The problem with ambiguity here is that it leaves the governance, the government, the agencies in China free to interpret the law as they may find. So it eventually seals the fate of people protesting in Hong Kong, being critical of Xi Jinping or the Communist Party of China, in the fate of the agencies. For instance, if you're also talking about if one is talking about Hong Kong's special administrative region status, that would qualify as secession. Under subversion, anyone who participates in any sort of collaboration with a foreign or a local authority to be critical of the Chinese government, to register a protest, to have an activist march, that would qualify as subversion. Now, last year we saw in Hong Kong that the protest led to the halting of the airport. A lot of street lights were destroyed because the protesters were worried that there were 5G devices installed in those street lights that could lead to facial recognition, that could lead to the monitoring of the protest. And so, in the new law, in the new national security law, terrorism also includes holding up the traffic. So, tomorrow, if a Hong Kong resident was to get in an argument with a police officer leading to the stopping of the traffic, that would qualify as terrorism. Now, this is Article 20. Now, coming to Article 30. China has often been critical of the foreign intervention, foreign interference in its internal affairs. Already, it made very strong statements against the United States leaders and senators who were being critical of China's action in Hong Kong. So, under Article 30 of the new national security law, any Hong Kong protester, activist, anyone critical of China's governance or government, if they collaborate with any foreign organization, that would also be led to a criminal charge. So, for instance, if tomorrow a Joshua Wong, a very prominent Hong Kong activist, was to write an article in the New York Times, that would not only qualify as a criminal act, even though New York Times is banned in China, it's banned in mainland China, and yet it would qualify as a criminal act, and action could be taken against Joshua Wong or any activist who does that. However, the most intriguing part of this entire national security law, the most unfortunate part perhaps, which should give nations, other nations, a wake up call, is Article 38. Now, it's okay for China to push down the law on its citizens, on the citizens of mainland China or Hong Kong. But under Article 38, anyone, any person who's not a permanent resident of Hong Kong, who is not even a resident of Hong Kong or China remotely, or any territory governed by China, for instance, if he's a citizen of India and he's been critical of China or Xi Jinping, as I am in this video, and if I were to step into China or Hong Kong tomorrow, the agencies there could arrest me and try me for the same criminal charges under the new national security law. This has actually happened. A Chinese student who was tweeting memes against Xi Jinping from an anonymous account in Canada, once he visited Hong Kong, he was picked up by the relevant agencies. This is the kind of ambiguity, opaqueness, and dictatorship that comes with the new national security law for the citizens of Hong Kong. Unfortunately, they cannot protest because even protesting against this qualifies as a crime under the new national security law. Some protesters tried this earlier this week on Wednesday, and 300 of them were actually arrested. Already, as a result of this national security law, a lot of democratic parties, a lot of activist groups, they have disbanded, they have disappeared from the ground, therefore giving Xi Jinping the clear victory he was hoping for. Now, Hong Kong, once upon a time, it was very important for China. In 1990s, early 1990s, it constituted one third of its GDP. Today, it's less than 3%. However, even then, from the point of perspective of the foreign direct investment, the inflows and the outflows, Hong Kong has been very important for China. That's the reason it's known as the gateway to China. In 2018, according to Morgan Stanley, 60% of the FDI inflows and outflows from China were routed through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is very important for China from that point of view. However, even if some experts feel, some analysts feel that companies would now like to withdraw their money from Hong Kong, companies which have set up shop there, all these MNCs, all the MNCs you can think of, especially ones which have their origins in the United States or Europe. Even if they were to come out of Hong Kong, there is a lot of Chinese money which is being waited to invest in Hong Kong. So the Chinese are already looking into fill the void which will be created by the exit of the companies which operated, which had their origins in the United States and United Kingdom. People are also leaving Hong Kong at a very steady pace. Already last year, after the protests, close to 30,000 people departed Hong Kong for better pastures. And that was the fastest rate since 2012. Now, with the new national security law that criminalizes every activity, not just for citizens of Hong Kong, but also people working in Hong Kong who might be citizens of some other nation, companies will be reevaluated to think how they really want to set up shop in Hong Kong. People will reevaluate their choice of working in Hong Kong. So that will lead to further exodus of people. Now, one can say that the Chinese mainland people will step in and, take over the office spaces, take over the commercial spaces. And that's what China really wants. They want more of China in Hong Kong. They want a Hong Kong, which is no longer the Western liberalized democratic principle governed city as it was. They want something which is a reflection of what happens in China. however opaque or however dictatorial might it be. Lastly, why does what China really fares now? What is going to be the consequence of all of this warrants a serious discussion. Now, the United States government, the Donald Trump government, is already threatening sanctions against the officials who've been a part of this entire creation of the national security law. They're already threatening sanctions against the companies who will be working with these officials. Now, the problem is China has been knowing about these sanctions for all this time. They have known that these sanctions were coming. And that is what China does. It doesn't stand by its international commitments. They committed to Great Britain that, the autonomous nature, the freedom, the democratic principles that are prevalent in Hong Kong, they will last until 2047. But in 2014, the same Chinese government did not allow British parliamentarians to visit Hong Kong. They did not allow them to visit this special administrative region. So that is how China goes back on its international commitments. Now, one can say that the sanctions will come into play. It might make life very difficult for some officials. But China has already been prepared for this. For China, for Xi Jinping right now, the political conquering of Hong Kong is a big achievement, something that will ease their stress to some extent. And it also serves out a message to nations across the world that China is not ready to play by the international rules. It's not ready to play by the democratic principles that have governed the West and a good significant part of Asia for so long. China is not ready to play by any of those rules. What they really prefer is their own version of communist meets dictatorship meets capitalism, and they want to show it down to the people of Hong Kong, and they're doing it right now. For Hong Kong's residents, the future seems bleak. No longer they can think about the regime. No longer they can think or dream about the democratic principles they were governed under for so long. From now on, it's going to be a very Chinese way of life in Hong Kong. And that is probably a sad day for everyone who stands up for democracy. But it's a successful day for China's president, Xi Jinping. Thank you. We at Swarajya are working towards creating more exclusive videos, podcasts, and analysis for our Swarajya Patreon subscribers. We've added a link in that description, and you can go ahead and support us for as little as $4.99 on a monthly basis. We look forward to your support. Keep watching, keep supporting Swarajya.